morning. That's our cue. Good morning. So good morning, good morning. And thank you all for being here. But thank you, Kalen, actually, for inviting me to moderate this session. There's very few times that you receive an email to moderate a talk with a topic as important and relevant as this one. So I very much appreciate being in this space. So a little bit about Kalen. So Kalen Kennedy is a doctoral candidate in clinical psychology at Marquette University. He was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, where he developed a strong sense of community and empathy. He earned his BS from Howard University, where he cultivated a passion for understanding psychological and social factors in marginalized communities. At Marquette, he received his MS in psychology and developed a research program focused on manifestations of racism, societal marginalization, and mental health disparities. Throughout his studies, Kalen has provided culturally sensitive care to underserved children and families. He has been awarded fellowships, including the Marquette University Graduate School Reverend John P. Rayner, S.J. Fellowship. Currently, he is completing the predoctoral clinical internship at UCLA and was just awarded yesterday, congrats, Caitlin, one of the inaugural Amy Horton Memorial Awards. I am happy to report that after graduation, he will continue his work as a Leslie and Richard Atlas Fellowship in early childhood and integrated care here at UCLA. Thank you, Caitlin, and take it away.
I appreciate you, Dr. Suarez. Thank you for agreeing to moderate this talk. I appreciate everyone for setting this up today. I appreciate all of you for being here. Sorry, as I awkwardly try and open my slides. All right, good, I appreciate that. So today I will be kind of presenting on some of the research from my dissertation. We changed the title of the presentation. It's entitled Exploring the Denial of Institutional Racism, Impacts of Social Identity, Perceptions of Privilege, and Threat. First, I want to make sure I note that I do not have any disclosures to make, and please feel free to enter any questions in the chat that you may have, and they'll be answered at the end of the presentation. So when I first found out that I was going to be presenting at Child Grand Rounds, I was initially kind of concerned about how my research might relate to pediatrics and mental health care in child populations. But I recognize that, like all of us, children exist within several different ecological systems that are all, unfortunately, susceptible to inequity and discrimination. So I think it's within our scope as mental health professionals to address health disparities that result from these systemic factors of racism, which are actually expounded on in this policy statement by the American Academy of Pediatrics. We must educate ourselves on the role of racial and ethnic identity, axes of privilege, and biases, and how those influence our lives and the lives of our patients. And we must understand the mechanisms that perpetuate inequity to advocate for and implement more inclusive and fair healthcare practices. And then finally, we serve patients of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds here at Semmel and Ronald Reagan and Motts. And it's paramount that we recognize and validate their lived experiences and make sure that we're not pathologizing their lived experiences. So to take a step back first, the term racism has been around since before the 1960s, but when it gained more colloquial popularity, it simply described deliberate prejudice based on race. But social scientists have kind of long considered the multifaceted nature of racism with two specific manifestations that I'm going to be talking about today. Individual racism, also called interpersonal, and that's the negative attitudes towards members of different racial and ethnic groups. And then institutional racism, which is the laws and practices that propagate the racial hierarchy in society, maintaining a dominant position for whites across various institutions or systems. Also, systemic racism, it's important for me to note, is used to kind of aggregate the laws and practices at an even higher level than a singular institution. And throughout the conversation or throughout the talk today, I may use it interchangeably based on kind of the focus of the research that I'm referencing or referencing my research in particular. And this is only to generally represent the manifestations of racism at a social level that's higher than the individual. And I recognize that they are not all this exact same construct, and they all have their own predictive validities and their own significance and like our understandings of racism in our society. But with that being said, there appears to be more variability in beliefs about racism outside of academia, and that's what I was really aiming to explore. So beliefs about systemic racism are especially variable among white individuals in the United States. For instance, a survey by the US News and World Report and the Harris Poll in 2022 found that 53% of white respondents believed in systemic racism, while 29% did not, and 18% were unsure. These findings were significant given the persistent racial inequities in the United States across different domains like health, housing, social institutions, socioeconomic status, policing, criminal justice, immigration, political participation, employment, and you can go on and on. So the purpose of my dissertation was to examine the denial of institutional racism that I'm sure we've heard in our personal lives, in the media, or unfortunately from some leaders of our country, to explore the roles of racial identity centrality or how important being white is to people, as well as the rejection of white privilege, and investigate the impacts of collective identity threats on this denial that we observe. So first, my research was couched in social identity theory, which suggests that individuals get some element of their self-concept from their belonging to a social group. And this can be any social group, but it's particularly social groups that the person feels are like salient to them. And it's been used to explain why people favor their in-group and they exhibit bias towards their out-groups. And according to social identity theory, people strive to keep a positive view of their social group in the same way we are all kind of biased to view ourselves in a slightly more positive light, intuitively. And this can be seen in the way that, for example, like sports fans maintain loyalty and form rivalries. But the research on racial identity and its relationship with self-esteem for white people in the US is a bit more complex. So it's actually been argued that white people do not perceive themselves to be racial actors. And in fact, research suggests that many white people may distance themselves from their racial identity to kind of serve different psychological functions, different functions. And this could be avoiding the prospect that their successes aren't fully earned or avoiding like this awareness of membership in a group that has been considered like morally suspect in different situations. So nevertheless, racial identity and related values are connected to beliefs about racism in white samples. Additionally, these beliefs influence attitudes towards racial inequality. For example, white American culture leads people to kind of conceptualize racism primarily in terms of individual racial prejudices rather than in terms of institutional practices that harm Black and brown people. White people are more likely to consider individual racism as a bigger problem contemporarily than institutional racism in the United States. And when presented with an example of racial inequality, white participants hold relatively more individual-led theories of racism. Again, thinking that individual or interpersonal racism is the main issue at play today in society. They are less likely to implicate institutional racism in those moments where they're witnessing inequalities. So finally, participants who found individual racism to be a bigger problem than structural racism were approximately half as likely to believe that the US criminal justice system favors white defendants. So the field knows quite a bit about relative beliefs among white people, but what role does their racial identity play in their own conceptualization? So we know that being a part of this racial group makes it more likely for people to share certain views about racism, but we don't know as much about what being in that racial group leads to different beliefs and what might best predict outright denial of institutional racism that we sometimes see. And racial identity centrality is one way to kind of better understand how important being white is to individuals' sense of self. It's referred to as the extent to which individuals consider their racial group a core component of their identity. And research suggests individuals with high racial identity centrality are more likely to engage in behaviors that protect their in-group status and respond defensively when they perceive threats against their group. The collective self-esteem scale was actually created in 1990 to assess self-esteem based on attitudes towards somebody's social group as opposed to attitudes about the individual. And it actually is shown to be correlated with individual self-esteem as well. The scale comprises 4 subscales, including the importance to identity subscale, which will be kind of key in my research today, which specifically measures the significance of one's group to their overall self-concept. So due to the limited research on the relationships between racial identity centrality and denial of institutional racism, it wasn't quite clear how the importance to identity subscale might kind of correlate with measures on beliefs about institutional racism. But I'll talk a little bit more about kind of my hypotheses going into the studies. And when thinking about racial identity centrality and why people may distance themselves from a certain identity, the role of perceived threat becomes very salient. And previous researchers explored individual threats to white participants' self-perceptions, which decrease their implications of institutional racism. Again, situations where they're presented with situations or instances of inequalities, racial inequalities, and they're asked to basically identify whether they believe that's an example of institutional racism. So previous researchers have provided participants with false feedback on fake intelligence tasks, as well as personality measures, and participants who were threatened were less likely to consider situations of inequality as examples of institutional racism. And these threats could be for like intelligence tasks, giving them like random GRE questions, and telling them that their answers, or they scored in like the 20th percentile and things like that. But considering that race is a social or collective identity, it's necessary to explore the effects of collective threat on denial of institutional racism. And in past research, immigration and the increased relative population of non-white Americans has been found to pose that type of collective threat in white samples. So one study that kind of initially utilized this threat stimuli was Craig and Richardson in 2014. And they manipulated this presentation of threat by showing participants demographic projections of the US by the year 2042, or the current racial demographic data. And that was considered the non-threat scenario in a brief article that participants were expected to read. And they found that participants in the threat condition express more explicit racial bias via preferences to associate with their own racial group and comparative discomfort interacting with people of other racial groups, as well as explicit negative attitudes toward the racial and minority groups. And this was seen in groups that weren't even being necessarily attributed to the changes in racial demographics. It was basically consistent across all racial and ethnic outgroups. And it was believed that a similar collective threat posed to white participants today might impact their racial identity centrality again, kind of making it more salient that they are white and leading to more denial and some of the other outcomes that I'll talk about in a second. One potential variable that has also played a role in previous research, kind of looking at attitudes about institutional racism, was white privilege. And white privilege is the societal advantage that white people have over other people, people of other racial and ethnic backgrounds due to their race. Awareness of white privilege has been described as the belief in racial inequality and recognition of the personal benefit from said inequality. So not only being aware necessarily that it exists or that there is a racial hierarchy, it's that able to identify their own place within that racial hierarchy. And it's important to clarify that although white privilege can be equated to institutional racism, it's more aptly conceptualized as a consequence of institutional racism that has different implications for a white person's sense of self, right? So whereas thinking about marginalized group disadvantage, excuse me, it may provoke some source of empathy or just consideration. Whereas thinking of undeserved inequality that benefits you, it might have more negative emotions that the person seeks to avoid. And there's been research that kind of supports this and suggests that that might lead to distancing from that idea or denial of the fact that white privilege exists. Because it's believed that particular conceptualizations impact the self-esteem of white people and could be the mechanism by which people come to deny institutional racism. So it was paramount for research to distinguish between support for white privilege and belief in institutional racism to accurately determine their relation to other key variables. So that brings me to my present research. So in one correlational study and in one experimental study, I hypothesized that racial identity centrality would predict the denial of institutional racism among white individuals. I predicted that the denial of white privilege would mediate or kind of explain that relationship between racial identity centrality and the denial of institutional racism. And I thought that that would look like greater racial identity centrality would lead to greater denial of white privilege, which would explain that increased denial of institutional racism. And introducing participants to a collective threat would lead to greater denial of institutional racism. And racial identity centrality and denial of white privilege would then mediate that relationship between collective threat and institutional racism. That was a lot of words, which I recognize, but I have some visual representations in later slides as I kind of go into what that looked like in each study. So first, study one, which I kind of aim to explore whether racial identity centrality predicted denial of institutional racism. And then I wanted to explore whether the relationship between racial identity centrality and denial of institutional racism might be mediated by denial of white privilege. So I hypothesized that the more important racial identity the more important white racial identity is to participants, the more likely they would be to deny institutional racism. So the more important whiteness was, the more likely they were to deny that institutional racism exists. I also hypothesized that denial of white privilege would be mediated by the relationship between racial identity centrality and denial of institutional racism, which would look like higher racial identity centrality would predict higher white privilege denial, and then that would predict greater denial of institutional racism. So my sample was 193 white participants above the age of 18. 52.3% identified as male, 44.6% identified as female, mean age was 36.4. I recruited participants through Prolific, which is a research participant sourcing platform. It's considered more transparent for participants than some comparable platforms, and they were compensated for their participation. So in terms of measures that were collected, a single item denial of institutional racism measure was actually created for the study. Participants were presented with this definition of institutional racism from O'Brien et al. in 2009. And following the definition, they were asked, based on the presented definition, do you believe that institutional racism currently exists in the United States? And they responded on a scale from 0 to 100, with 0 indicating that institutional racism does not exist, and 100 indicating that it does. The question and the response options were kind of structured in that way to minimize demand characteristics and avoid participant bias, because obviously like I was exploring denial, but the questions were flipped. So the average score was 78.28 and standard deviation was 28.05. The scores were later kind of reverse coded for analyses to maintain the thematic consistency with denial. And in addition to the denial measure, the collective self-esteem scale modified for racial and ethnic group identity was also collected, specifically that importance to identity subscale that I spoke about earlier, which comprised 4 items, which include statements like, the racial ethnic group I belong to is an important reflection of who I am. They responded on a 7-point Likert scale. The average for that was 3.10. Standard deviation was 1.46, and it had pretty high Cronbach's alpha within this population. And then finally, participants also completed the denial of white privilege scale by Swim and Miller. And that's a 5-item scale with questions like, I feel that white skin in the United States opens many doors for whites during their everyday lives. Participants indicated their agreement with the statements using 7-point Likert scale from strongly disagree at 1 to strongly agree at 7. The mean or the average for this was 3.47, standard deviation 1.92, and even higher Cronbach's alpha within this population. So in addition to these measures, participants completed demographic questions, including political identity, which I will foreshadow had a significant role in this research. So now for results, hypothesis 1 was supported. There was a weak positive correlation between importance to identity and denial of institutional racism, such that the more important being white was to participants, the more likely they were to deny that institutional racism exists. However, there was no correlation found between racial identity centrality and denial of white privilege, although there was a correlation between denial of white privilege and denial of institutional racism. So hypothesis 2, that denial of white privilege would actually mediate the relationship, was not supported because the assumptions weren't met to even run the mediation. There was no significant correlation between, again, racial identity centrality and denial of white privilege. Now, in addition to that, I ran some exploratory analyses, with a collapsed version of the categorical political identity variable. So participants were placed, were either identified as Democrats, Independents, or Republicans. The sample was really underrepresented for Republicans and Independents, which likely had some implications in the data as well. But Republicans, there were 37 participants who identified as Republican, 119 actually identified as Democrats, and 34 who identified as Independents, which does not represent the United States population, or the political identities of white participants within, white people within the United States based on general polling. So for Democrats, what that looked like, they were more likely to believe in institutional and individual racism. Being white was actually less important to their sense of self compared to Republicans, and they were more likely to acknowledge white privilege. Independents were somewhat in the middle on their beliefs about institutional racism. They were less likely to deny that institutional racism, they were less likely to deny individual racism as well compared to Republicans. Being white was less central to their identity compared to Republicans, and Independents were less likely to deny white privilege compared to Republicans. Republicans were the most likely to deny the existence of both institutional and individual racism. They were more likely to see whiteness as central to their sense of self, and they were more likely to deny that white privilege exists, or that they benefit in any way from white privilege. So the findings indicated a weak positive correlation between racial identity centrality and the denial of institutional racism, although it was significant. But moreover, a strong positive correlation was observed between the denial of white privilege and the denial of institutional racism, which was consistent with what I was expecting. However, there was no correlation between racial identity centrality and denial of white privilege to kind of meet the assumptions for the hypothesized mediation. So as was previously mentioned, research has suggested that some white individuals who acknowledge institutional racism may actually distance themselves from their racial identity to kind of mitigate that discomfort that they might feel if they acknowledge privilege. However, the current findings suggest that participants reported belief in white privilege was unrelated to how central being white was to their self-concept, at least in their own self-report, right? So future research is needed to explore alternative measures of white privilege acknowledgement and examine their relationship with white identity, and also acknowledge that although there might be logical connections between some of these attitudes, people do form their own lay theories about systems and constructs in our society that make sense to them and tend to kind of like serve their own psychological functions too, including things like self-esteem. But finally, political affiliation had a significant influence on beliefs. The political findings suggest that denial of institutional racism may be more common for those who identify as Republicans. Additionally, racial identity centrality was higher in this population, so that whiteness was more salient for people who identified as Republicans. So beliefs may be more variable in the sample with more variability in political identities, and making sure that future research kind of represents the United States landscape, even within one specific racial group. Now for study 2. So although in study 1, there was no evidence to support that racial identity centrality predicted denial of white privilege, there was still support for the idea that it predicted denial of institutional racism. So study 2 actually explored whether threats to one's social identity would increase white individuals' denial of institutional racism. Additionally, I explored whether racial identity centrality and beliefs about white privilege might mediate that relationship. So the specific hypotheses were participants presented with collective group threat would express greater denial of institutional racism. So the more threatened group would deny more. And then racial identity centrality and denial of white privilege would serially mediate this relationship between collective identity threat and denial of institutional racism. And that would look like the threatened group leading to higher racial identity centrality or viewing their race as more salient after they've been threatened, potentially denying more institutional racism, or excuse me, denying more white privilege, and then in turn denying more institutional racism. So the participants for this sample were 203 white participants, again, above 18 years old, based on the general criteria. 48.4% were male, 48.3% identified as female. The mean age was 39.6, and they were, again, recruited through Prolific and compensated for their participation. Participants were then placed in one of two conditions. They were either in like the threat or the control condition. And to elicit perceptions of white collective group threat, participants were instructed to read this, or one of these two reports from the Pew Research Center. The threatening report discussed anticipated demographic shifts in the United States, highlighting an expected population increase by the year 2050. And this growth was primarily attributed to immigrants and their descendants, which would result in whites becoming a numerical minority in the United States by the year 2050. The control condition report detailed recent changes in demographic profile of online dating. And the report was kind of carefully edited to match the threat report structure and modified to discuss projected demographic changes among online daters, specifically the increases of 18 to 24-year-old online daters at the expense of the 25 to 55 or 54-year-old group. And this framing was mirrored the demographic shifts that were reported in the threat condition. And following the reading on their assigned report, participants completed comprehension questions concerning the key changes described in the text to make sure that there was adequate engagement with the actual articles. So after completing the reading and the comprehension questions, participants completed the same measures from study 1, the denial of institutional racism measure, racial identity centrality, and denial of white privilege. Now for the results. It was hypothesized that participants presented with the collective group threat would express greater denial of institutional racism. This was not supported. There was no significant effect of threat exposure on denial of institutional racism. Furthermore, there was no significant difference between threat and control conditions on racial identity centrality or denial of white privilege. Actually, the threat also didn't impact any of the key variables in that context. So hypothesis 4, which suggested that participants encountering white collective group threat would attribute greater significance to their identity, exhibit increased denial of white privilege, and subsequently demonstrate heightened denial of institutional racism. This was not supported as well. Technically, the assumptions weren't met to explore the serial mediation because of the insignificant relationships with that threat predictor and the outcome variables, although there was significant correlations found between collective white racial identity and denial of institutional racism, again, in the sample, and collective white racial identity and denial of white privilege, excuse me, and denial of institutional racism, as was found in the previous study. So did the exploratory analyses using political identity for this sample as well. Pretty similarly, Republicans were underrepresented in this sample with only an N of 37. There were 118 Democrats in the study, and then there were 34 independents. Democrats were more likely to believe in institutional and individual racism. There was no difference in racial centrality compared to other parties within this sample, and Democrats were most likely to acknowledge white privilege. Independents were somewhere in the middle on their beliefs about institutional racism. They were less likely to deny individual racism compared to Republicans. There was no difference, again, in racial centrality compared to other parties, and they were less likely to deny white privilege compared to Republicans. So Republicans were most likely to deny the existence of institutional and individual racism, both. There was no difference on racial centrality, and then more likely to deny white privilege. So the difference within the sample was primarily that there was really no greater significance for Republicans in racial identity centrality, but Republicans were, again, underrepresented within the sample, so there will be more to kind of explore in the future regarding the relationship between political identity and kind of like the centrality or like the importance of whiteness. So contrary to hypotheses, the results did not support the notion that exposure to collective group threat would increase denial of institutional racism among white participants. It has been shown to affect negative outgroup attitudes in the past, but this may be a unique outgroup attitude or a more entrenched outgroup attitude. Previous research has shown that threats to individual intelligence and personality decrease endorsement of white privilege among white participants compared to those whose abilities are affirmed. So we anticipated that collective threat to white racial group would kind of similarly result in increased denial of white privilege and the existence of institutional racism. We speculated that belief in institutional racism might be as malleable, or we speculate that belief in institutional racism might not be, excuse me, as malleable as other racial attitudes, specifically like individual policy questions that have been used in previous studies, or larger measures that are able to kind of pick up on greater nuance. However, our findings suggest that these threats may have reduced saliency over time, or reported beliefs about institutional racism may be more fixed than kind of hypothesized, more crystallized in people's worldview. In fact, denial of institutional racism may be more strongly associated with something kind of static, like their political party alignment. Consistent with study 1, strong linear correlation was observed in the current study between denial of white privilege and denial of institutional racism. However, neither belief in white privilege nor institutional racism was significantly influenced by the manipulation. Consistent with results of study 1, there was no relationship between self-reported racial identity centrality. Surprisingly, there was also no relationship between denial of white privilege or denial of institutional racism in the sample, suggesting more variability in some reported associations. So to kind of summarize what was happening in study 1 is correlational. We found weak positive correlation between racial identity centrality and denial of institutional racism. We found no significant mediation by denial of white privilege, and political party affiliation had a pretty strong influence on beliefs about institutional racism. And then in study 2, which was the experimental study, where participants experienced that collective threat, there was no significant effect of the collective threat on denial of institutional racism. Political party affiliation, again, shown to be kind of a stronger predictor than racial identity centrality, which is kind of interesting for the fact that the outcomes were specifically related to racial attitudes and kind of central to who the people, who's kind of central to the person's social identities. And then findings suggest that political ideology is more entrenched in beliefs about racism than potentially racial identity for white participants. So although 3 of the 4 hypotheses were unsupported, there are several implications of the current research, and possible that the denial of institutional racism is not as malleable as other beliefs about racism. It may be more crystallized in our identities, and the context where certain language is normalized. I think that probably also played a significant role in the introduction of threat. Although the same threats that was used has been shown to have implications on policy decisions, specifically like border protection, quote unquote, and attitudes about affirmative action more recently, like within the past 2 years. It's possible that the introduction of this type of threat that white people might become a numerical minority has been described in the media significantly enough that it's not impacting people in a consistent way or in as impactful of a way as it did in the past. It's also possible that people kind of reacted or doubled down on their existing beliefs or existing explanations that they would have for that threat based on the media that they consume and kind of the alignment of their political identities and what their political party might say when talking about demographic changes. So this also might be relevant for the perceptions of threat and what changes people's attitudes in the current political climate. Political identity may be a stronger predictor of attitudes towards institutional racism than reported racial identity centrality, at least. And it will be important for potential interventions to kind of consider political ideologies to effectively address the denial of institutional racism, which tends to be a pretty hard line or barrier to kind of conversations around addressing systemic inequities if people outright deny that the inequities exist in the first place. And although denial was explored in the current research to more closely imitate colloquial conversation, self-report measures may not fully capture the complexity of beliefs about institutional racism. So future directions should aim to include participants with more varied political affiliations and racial identity centrality, consider variables such as like social economic status, education level, and geographic location. Make sure they examine psychological processes not covered in the study, considering other motivational factors in addition to denial, like the distancing of oneself from the issues entirely, or kind of becoming more driven to dismantle systems of inequality as a result of acknowledging white privilege and acknowledging that those systems are at play. And then it'll be important to kind of track changes in beliefs about institutional racism over time and assess the stability of political and racial identities and shaping these beliefs, because they're also probably pretty significantly impacted by what's going on in the political atmosphere at the time as well. Right, and then that is it. Now we'll open this up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Wow. I actually, we have a question in the queue, but I want to invite people to post some questions. I actually was taking notes, and through the last results, I wrote a big ideology question mark to myself. This is what ideology, the definition of ideology, right?
Mhm.
So I have a question from Dr. Emerson. I have some questions myself, but I want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. Please ask questions in the chat. So it says, thank you, Dr. Kennedy, for a very stimulating talk. A couple of weeks
Mhm.
away, but we're giving it to you. I'm wondering if you consider looking at degree of nationalism, for example, identification as American as a proxy for whiteness for individuals who identify as white and American. It seems many people don't feel white, but do feel American and have an implicit assumption of the American identity as being Caucasian. I wonder if this is aligned with citizenship rather than race, might mask racism and promote denial of individual and systemic racism.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think overall within the United States, racial identity centrality doesn't tend to be as salient for larger white for the white population. Um, so there are other identities, whether it's just like their national identity, that might be more important for them and might actually predict outcomes. Um, and I think it's also probably more related to threat, especially, and we think about like xenophobia, and threat or concerns about like demographic changes, and changing like their perceptions of what they believe the current state of America is, and trying to like bring America back, quote unquote, to a wider um, a wider population that aligns more with what they believe America was always, inaccurately, of course. But I think that would definitely have a significant impact on a lot of these attitudes, because overall, although white racial identity is important in terms of predicting people's attitudes and their behaviors and their voting behaviors and their approach to policy, it's not something that people explicitly say that is very important to them on a personal level. So it's like has predictive validity without it necessarily being being a cognizant, like a cognizant or like intentional factor in like how people move through the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Dr. Walsha has a good question. I have one question before that. So Dr. Walsha, I'm gonna ask one question and then I'm gonna go to your question. How do you address potential biases in self-reported measures of racial identity centrality and denial of institutional racism? And I actually wondered too if you think people really understood what institutional racism meant and if there was a definition in the question, or is that something that you considered?
Yeah. So the question that I posed to them was first presented with a definition of what institutional racism was. That was kind of actually like taken from a high school textbook, so that I could try and make it as like approachable as possible, in terms of like language and not getting too scientific or social scientific. But there's definitely potential for bias, and my intention in making it like a single item measure and it being very straightforward was to kind of imitate or represent the conversations that people have more colloquially around racism, and people not necessarily going into depth about every detail of context in which they might view something as maybe racist or maybe not racist, whether this type of inequality is an example of systemic racism versus this one not being. I wanted to kind of more openly represent the people who report that it just does not exist. The people who see it and they refuse to even engage in the conversation around its impact, around the experiences that people have. And that's why the measure was kind of created the way it was, but there was a definition. And I think that there obviously is bias in the way that people are going to respond. There's like social desirability, And there's going to be concerns about how they might be perceived. Um, and it might not be how it might not align with the things that they say or the things that they believe in their like personal lives. But I think that that also kind of represents like a specific picture because we are seeing more people feel comfortable openly denying institutional racism exists, denying racism in general exists. And that's what I think I was trying to kind of capture a little bit more, um, is kind of how bias isn't as impactful or isn't as kind of hampering people's beliefs as it used to. It kind of used to tamp down at least on people's reports and the things that people say to try to be more socially desirable. But that seems to like not be the case anymore as significantly as it used to be. So I kind of wanted to get at that intentionally and kind of see like who are the people that are willing to say like, no, I don't think it exists, even though that might not be socially acceptable.
Yeah, and I actually appreciate this presentation a lot in this discussion because I think there's been a lot of like now institutional racism and these terms have now become part of our day-to-day vocabulary, whereas there's people that have been working on this field for years, decades, right? Um, but I appreciate you bringing it here because in the last year, 2 years, right, there's been like almost like a backlash and a threat to, I think, academic freedom and academic discourse around this topic. So I appreciate you bringing it to the conversation in the context of research. You actually are looking at research, people's views, and for topics that might be uncomfortable for some. I think this kind of research and presentation elevates the conversation to where we can actually let our guard down and have good, meaningful conversations around this. So I really, really appreciate this. I'm going to go with the question by Dr. Walsha. It says, fantastic talk, Caleb. I'm glad you brought your research to the child division because, as you pointed out, it's something that's important across the lifespan and an ecological consideration for our child patients. So the question is, how do you think we can utilize this research in clinical interactions with families, white or not white?
I think the biggest thing that kind of pops out for me is like our approach to health disparities, our approach to health disparities as well as kind of like barriers and being able to see the different manifestations of mental health challenges in different groups and look at the structural, well, see those differences and start to immediately look towards like the structural factors that might be at play that kind of lead to those differences, as opposed to just kind of assuming there's some type of inherent or some type of like essential difference in these groups based on solely like their racial identity. So having a more kind of ecological approach to kind of why are our patients presenting to us? What are the problems that they're reporting that they're experiencing and kind of like how does that map onto our diagnostic criteria and the way that we consider like pathology.
Great, 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 great. Um, I have another question from Mahati Kasuri. She said, thank you for this cutting edge research, Dr. Kennedy. I'm wondering if you could share your experience researching this topic as a Black man in a white institution during such a political climate. Any hurdles you would like to share? Are you mindfully choosing journals which will be open to publishing this topic?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, Malati. I kind of went into grad school with more of like an expectation to do specifically like health disparities research and more like Black and Brown communities. But I was not in the most diverse place or in most diverse location. So although like the patients were there, I doing more experimental and like social psych research, I never wanted to like experiment on marginalized communities or try and like kind of pathologize their experiences if I didn't think that it would like inherently benefit them and their community. So I think that that's why I've had so much focus on kind of like white racial identity and like racism and how that's experienced by white people because it's a really recent field, I think, compared to like African American psych and like Latino psych, like racial identity development for white people wasn't even really a construct prior to 10, 15 years ago. So it was something that I kind of shifted a lot of my work towards because it felt like it's important. And also like in this context, it's something that I think people do need to engage more with.
Wow, you kind of flipped the research question on its head, right? Like that's what it sounds like to me. And I love that you said you don't want to over pathologize or pathologize further Black and Brown communities. That's amazing. I have a very silly question in the context of very important topic. Can you educate some of us on prolific? And you don't have to spend a lot of time just because we have other important questions, but like on the platform that you use to gather the data.
Yeah, it's similar to like Amazon Mechanical Turk, if you're familiar with that. They're like a sourcing platform for people who want to participate in research and just get paid for participating in research. So it's a lot of people's kind of like side job or side hustle. And they can get paid to do online studies. A lot of it can be like marketing from corporations. A lot of it is like research for in an academic context. People who need more just like general samples. They don't need it to be like specific clinical populations or health populations necessarily. It's easier to kind of gather people in that way. And it spans well, it technically spans the world, but you can like focus within like spanning the United States a little bit more effectively than just trying to use like an undergrad sample where it gets really homogeneous. So obviously like there are limits to using Prolific and Amazon Mechanical Turk too, because there do tend to be like similar people who want to do online studies in the middle of the day for like back to back to back for smaller amounts of money. But it is effective at kind of having more variability or more diversity in your research than just doing the simple giving undergrads credit for showing up.
Right. And I actually wonder in general, but I also wonder because of the overrepresentation of a political group in the sample.
Mhm.
And speaking about political groups, the other question I have is do you or a comment or a question or can you elaborate on how these findings might apply to more liberal leaning individuals?
Yeah, absolutely. So although a lot of the results kind of appeared to differentiate or find like significant differences just for Republicans, I think it definitely speaks to the context and the environments that people are in and that people are having these conversations about racism in. And I think that that's both salient for Republicans as well as for people who might identify as Democrats or might be more liberal leaning. Because regardless of their political affiliation, like we're still not seeing correlations between like identity centrality, like racial identity centrality, and like attitudes about white privilege. So there are still kind of unique lay theories or like unique ways that they go about coming to their beliefs that aren't always in like the most, I don't know, not necessarily the most logical way. But it's important for them to think through kind of like what is the I don't know, the psychological benefit somebody might have, for example, from denying that they're white or like from not finding whiteness to be important to themselves because overall most white people don't. And kind of like why is that? Why is that important? Why is it, or excuse me, why is it not important? And how does that distancing kind of allow people to either go about their day-to-day lives without acknowledging white privilege, or kind of like even how does it motivate them to fight against institutional racism, systemic racism, inequalities in our society. So it's not inherently like a bad thing either. It's just not as straightforward and logical as we might expect
Yeah.
about kind of how people come to their decisions and um, their way of like addressing racism in our society. So it's important for people to kind of think through how they got to where they are as well.
Thank you. And I actually I have a background in sociology. I double major in psychology and sociology. So the sociology lover in me feels like it would be great to look at SES and how this plays out across different SES. But we are in a child psychiatry grand rounds, and there's people or child and adolescent rounds, and there's people here at all stages of training. So I would love it if you could leave us with some pearls of wisdom about future research and how to build on your findings to further explore the relationship between collective identity threats and attitudes towards institutionalized racism.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so first, I want to make sure that people consider like their racial identity and the relationship that racial identity has in people's attitudes and people's beliefs, how it shapes the way people move through the world. Um, People considering their own white privilege and the relationship that that has, because for everybody, or for white samples in general, it does have a relationship with people's attitudes towards institutional racism consistently. Um, Thinking about kind of the echo chambers that people live within in terms of like political identities and how information is shared and how um, somewhat salient threats and like somewhat salient news and media might not be affecting us in the same way that it has in the past. The way that people are kind of reacting in terms of denying different beliefs or different things that they're observing in their day-to-day lives, um, distancing themselves from um, pretty significant issues within our day-to-day lives and kind of motivating more people to kind of use this information and use their own understandings of themselves to move more towards like dismantling it, which I think is really important, especially when we're working on like an individual level with patients, especially kids, because I think like my favorite part about working with kids is like the fact that we have so much control over their environments and we can like look into not only like their home environment but talking with like schools and seeing what their school environment is like, which is another system, their healthcare, so looking at their providers, which is another system that they're in, and kind of being able to identify ways that a lot of parents might be like observing discrimination or inequities, and seeing like how we can address that best.
I love it. Thank you so much. Because at the end of the day, that's what's important. I like to say, like, that's the privilege in and of itself is that you don't have to think about the privilege, right? Whereas some of us think about it from the moment we wake up about how we're going to show up, what we're going to wear, what's our hair going to look like, what's my accent going to look like, how am I going to pronounce words, how am I going to be perceived when I go into a patient encounter, which at the end of the day, it's what's relevant to all of us here, and we cannot leave that anywhere. We have to carry it with us all day. Again, that's the privilege in and of itself, is that you don't have to think about the privilege, right?
Mhm.
And I so again appreciate you bringing this your research forward and presenting it to us and allowing us to have a much elevated conversation, because it does feel less threatening to some people, and we need to have the conversations to be able to move forward.
Absolutely.
Kaylin, thank you,
I appreciate you.
thank you. I appreciate you. Thank you.